The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. As Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gazed toward the horizon on June 4, 1942, the same crimson orb that had blessed Japan's stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific now seemed to mock him with its indifferent brilliance. In the distance, somewhere beyond the curved edge of the world, lay Midway Atoll, a speck of coral and sand that would determine the fate of empires. Nagumo's weathered hands gripped the bridge rail as he contemplated the audacious plan conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The architect of Pearl Harbor had envisioned Midway as the decisive blow that would cripple the American Pacific Fleet once and for all. Four of Japan's finest aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, formed the striking force, their decks bristling with the most advanced naval aircraft in the world. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: draw the remaining American fleet into a trap, destroy it utterly, and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace. The first wave of Japanese aircraft had already thundered off the carrier decks. At dawn, their engines roaring like mechanical dragons as they disappeared into the morning haze. 108 planes, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters streaked toward Midway's defenses. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tomonaga led the formation, his Kate torpedo bomber cutting through the Pacific air with deadly precision. Behind him, the cream of Japan's naval aviation followed in perfect formation, their rising sun insignia gleaming in the early light. On Midway itself, American radar operators had detected the incoming wave at 0600 hours. The small garrison, commanded by Colonel Harold Shannon, scrambled every available aircraft to meet the threat. Ancient Brewster Buffalo fighters, their obsolete designs no match for the nimble Japanese Zeros, nonetheless rose to defend the atoll. With desperate courage, Marine pilots, many fresh from flight school, climbed into their cockpits knowing they faced superior numbers and better aircraft. The battle was joined with savage intensity. Japanese bombs rained down on Midway's installations, setting fuel depots ablaze and reducing hangars to twisted metal. The airfield's runway, cratered by high explosives, became a moonscape of destruction. Marine anti-aircraft guns barked defiance from their sandbagged positions, sending streams of tracer fire into the sky like deadly fireworks. The acrid smell of cordite and burning aviation fuel filled the air, as both sides fought with the desperation of men who knew their nation's fate hung in the balance. But as Tomonaga's aircraft began their return journey to the carrier force, a disturbing message crackled through the radio static. The American defenses had proven more resilient than expected. The runway, though damaged, remained operational. A second strike would be necessary to complete the destruction of Midway's ability to launch aircraft. This seemingly minor tactical adjustment would prove to be the first crack in Japan's carefully constructed plan. Back on the Akagi, Nagumo faced the first of many agonizing decisions that would define this day. The second wave of aircraft, originally armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking American ships, would need to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for ground targets. The process would take precious time that might allow the American fleet to close the distance, unknown to Nagumo. That fleet was already much closer than he imagined, racing toward what would become the most decisive naval battle in Pacific history. 300 miles to the northeast, rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, his calm demeanor masking the intensity of the moment. The American task force had achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare: complete tactical surprise against a superior enemy. This advantage had not come through luck or divine intervention, but through the painstaking work of cryptographers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, who had cracked the Japanese naval code. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rockford and his team of codebreakers had performed what many considered impossible, working around the clock in their basement bunker, surrounded by IBM tabulating machines and intercept equipment. They had deciphered enough of the Japanese JN-25 code to reveal Yamamoto's entire operational plan. The intelligence breakthrough, confirmed through careful analysis of intercepted communications, had given Admiral Chester Nimitz the greatest gift: A commander could receive knowledge of his enemy's intentions. According to declassified U.S. Navy records from the National Archives, the code-breaking effort represented one of the most significant intelligence victories in military history. The American fleet that now approached Midway consisted of 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. The latter ship, damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, had been patched together in a miraculous 72-hour repair effort at Pearl Harbor. Welders had worked around the clock, their torches creating showers of sparks, as they sealed hull plates and restored essential systems. The Yorktown should have required 3 months of repairs, but American ingenuity and determination had returned her to combat readiness in 3 days. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the overall task force commander aboard Yorktown, had positioned his carriers to catch the Japanese force at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The enemy would be recovering their Midway strike force, while simultaneously preparing for a second attack on the atoll. Flight decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, and ordnance scattered about it would be the perfect time to strike at 0700 hours. A PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80 had spotted the Japanese carrier force. The laconic report crackled through the radio. Carrier bearing 30, distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. The message electrified the American task force. After months of playing defense across the Pacific, they finally had the opportunity to strike back at Japan's elite carrier force, Spruance. Commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet made the crucial decision to launch immediately, rather than wait for the ideal range. He chose to attack while the Japanese were still recovering from their Midway strike. The gamble was enormous. Launching at maximum range meant his aircraft would have barely enough fuel to return. Many would not make it back, but the tactical situation demanded bold action. The flight decks of the American carriers erupted into controlled chaos as air crews prepared for the largest naval air strike in history. Dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters were spotted on deck, their engines warming up in the morning sun. Pilots received their final briefings, studying hastily drawn maps of the suspected Japanese position. Many of these young aviators had never seen combat. Others were veterans of the earlier Pacific battles. All understood the magnitude of the moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the Enterprise Air Group, climbed into his SBD Dauntless dive bomber with the weight of expectation on his shoulders. The target coordinates were based on projections of Japanese movement. If the enemy had altered course or speed, the entire strike might find empty ocean. It was a calculated risk that epitomized the American approach to this battle: aggressive, innovative, and willing to gamble everything on a single throw of the dice. As the first American aircraft lifted off from the carrier decks, the rising sun that had witnessed Japan's string of victories now looked down upon a very different kind of naval engagement. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the Pacific War was about to reach its turning point. The formation of 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet flew through the morning sky like a funeral procession, their obsolete airframes struggling to maintain formation against the Pacific headwinds. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8, knew his aircraft were flying coffins. The TBD Devastator, once the pride of American naval aviation, had been rendered obsolete by advances in fighter technology and anti-aircraft defenses. Its maximum speed of barely 200 miles per hour made it a sitting duck for the nimble Japanese Zero fighters. Waldron had trained his squadron relentlessly for this moment, drilling them in low-level torpedo attacks until the maneuvers became second nature. He understood better than most that their Mark 13 torpedoes were unreliable, often failing to detonate even when they struck their targets. The odds were stacked impossibly against them, yet duty demanded they press forward. Before takeoff, Waldron had told his men with characteristic bluntness, "We're going in. We may not come back, but we're going to hit something." The Japanese carrier force materialized out of the morning haze like a mirage of steel and smoke. For aircraft carriers steamed in formation. their flight decks busy with the controlled chaos of aircraft operations. The Akagi and Kaga were the largest, their massive hulls cutting through the Pacific swells with practiced efficiency. The smaller Soryu and Hiryu flanked them, their crews working frantically to rearm and refuel the returning Midway strike force. As Torpedo Squadron 8 began their attack run, the sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Black puffs of smoke from the carrier's guns dotted the air like deadly flowers, while the sharp crack of smaller caliber weapons created a metallic symphony of destruction. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, alerted to the American approach, dove from altitude like hawks, striking prey. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya's Zero fighters, their engines screaming in the dive, opened fire with devastating effect. The first Devastator exploded in a ball of orange flame, its torpedo tumbling harmlessly into the sea, then another and another. The Japanese pilots showed no mercy, their cannon shells and machine gun bullets ripping through the American formation. With methodical precision, Waldron's own aircraft, riddled with bullets, began to lose altitude as hydraulic fluid streamed from severed lines. He fought the controls, trying to maintain course for the torpedo release point, but the Devastator was dying beneath him. Ensign George Gay, flying the last aircraft in the formation, watched in horror as his squadron mates fell one by one. The sea below was littered with wreckage and oil slicks, marking the graves of American aviators who had given their lives in a desperate gamble. His own torpedo bomber, damaged by Zero fighter attacks, struggled to remain airborne. The fabric control surfaces fluttered like wounded birds, and the engine coughed black smoke with each labored revolution. When Gay finally released his torpedo at the Kaga, he knew it was futile. The massive carrier turned away, easily avoiding the slow-running weapon. Seconds later, his Devastator hit the water with bone-jarring force, the impact throwing him against the instrument panel. As his aircraft sank beneath the waves, Gay managed to extract himself from the cockpit and swim to the surface. He would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, witness to one of the most gallant and tragic episodes in American naval history. The attack had achieved nothing tangible. No torpedoes found their marks, no carriers suffered damage, but the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches undefended. The Japanese pilots, exhilarated by their easy victory over the obsolete American torpedo bombers, failed to climb back to altitude. They were celebrating their triumph when the next wave of American aircraft approached from above. Admiral Nagumo, watching the destruction of the American torpedo attack from the bridge of the Akagi, felt a moment of grim satisfaction. The Americans had shown courage, but courage alone could not overcome superior technology and training. His carriers had emerged unscathed, and the enemy had revealed their position while accomplishing nothing. The morning's operations were proceeding according to plan, despite the unexpected appearance of American carrier aircraft. But fate, as Nagumo would soon learn, rarely follows the plans of admirals. High above the Japanese task force, invisible against the morning sun, the real threat was already beginning its dive toward the undefended carrier decks. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had not been in vain. It had created the conditions for one of the most decisive air attacks in naval history. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty ocean, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels as he searched for the Japanese fleet. The Enterprise Air Group had been flying for over 2 hours, following outdated position reports that had led them to barren seas. Behind him, 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers maintained formation, their pilots growing increasingly anxious. As precious fuel burned away with each passing minute, the decision to continue the search had been McCluskey's alone. Standard procedure called for returning to base when fuel reached critical levels, but the squadron leaders sensed this might be America's only chance to strike back at Japan's elite carrier force. He had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, its white wake cutting through the blue Pacific like an arrow pointing toward its destination. Following his instincts, McCluskey altered course to follow the destroyer's heading. At exactly 10:24 a.m., the Japanese carrier force materialized beneath them like a target in a shooting gallery. The 4 aircraft carriers steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks, and ordnance carts loaded with bombs and torpedoes waited to be loaded onto the waiting aircraft. The timing was perfect. The Japanese were caught at their most vulnerable moment. McCluskey's voice crackled through the radio. "Attack immediately. Dick, take the Kaga. I'll take the Akagi." Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading the 2nd Division, acknowledged the order and began his dive toward the nearest carrier. The dauntless dive bombers rolled over and plunged toward their targets, their engines screaming as they accelerated through the thin air. The Japanese lookouts spotted the American attack. At the last possible moment, air raid sirens wailed across. The task force's anti-aircraft guns swung skyward, but it was too late. The dive bombers were already committed to their attack runs, plunging down at 70-degree angles like mechanical meteors. Zero fighters, caught refueling on the carrier decks, could not intercept the high-altitude attack. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's bombing squadron from the Yorktown arrived simultaneously from a different angle, turning the attack into a perfectly coordinated assault. The Japanese carriers, which had seemed invincible just moments before, found themselves helpless against the rain of 1,000-pound bombs falling from the morning sky. The first bomb struck the Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar bay among the fully fueled and armed aircraft. The detonation triggered a chain reaction as aviation gasoline ignited in a massive fireball that tore through the carrier's vitals. Secondary explosions shook the great ship as torpedo warheads cooked off in the intense heat. Within minutes, the pride of the Japanese fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. The Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate. 3 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, the first penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft being prepared for launch. The second bomb detonated in the island's superstructure, killing most of the bridge crew and severing vital communication lines. The third bomb, delivered by Ensign Frederick Weber, struck the forward elevator and sent it crashing into the hangar deck in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the Kaga, watched in horror as his ship was consumed by flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fed by thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and dozens of armed aircraft. Damage control parties fought valiantly to contain the blaze, but the conflagration had already grown beyond their ability to control. The carrier's ammunition magazines, heated by the intense fires, began to explode in sequence, each detonation sending shockwaves through the dying ship. The Soryu met a similar fate, struck by 3 bombs that turned her flight deck into a crater of twisted steel and burning aircraft. The carrier's crew, caught completely by surprise, had no time to implement damage control procedures. Within 20 minutes of the first bomb hit, the ship was listing heavily to port, her flight deck awash with burning aviation fuel. In the span of 6 minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 of their 4 fleet carriers. The ships that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months were now burning wrecks, their aircraft and experienced aircrews consumed by the fires of their own fuel and ammunition. The tables had turned with shocking suddenness, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed to the Americans. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last operational carrier in Admiral Nagumo's once mighty task force, watching the funeral pyres of his sister ships burn against the morning sky. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were consumed by fires that no human effort could extinguish, their crews abandoning ship as explosions rocked the dying vessels. The sight would have broken the spirit of lesser men, but Kaku was a product of the Imperial Navy's warrior tradition, and defeat was not in his vocabulary. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from the Hiryu, had already made the decision to continue the attack while the other carriers burned. His ship would strike back at the Americans with every aircraft at his disposal. The Hiryu's flight deck buzzed with activity as 18 dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters prepared for launch. It was a pitifully small force compared to the massive air armadas that had dominated the Pacific, but it represented Japan's last hope for salvaging something from the disaster. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the first strike from the Hiryu, his Valdive bomber lifting off the carrier deck with practiced precision. Behind him, the remaining aircraft of the one-Sprout carrier division followed in formation, their pilots grimly determined to exact revenge for their fallen comrades. The aviators had been told their target was an American carrier, likely the Yorktown, whose position had been reported by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The Yorktown, steaming with Task Force 17 under Admiral Fletcher's command, had been spotted by Japanese search planes at 11:30 a.m. The carrier's radar operators detected the incoming strike at approximately noon, giving the ship's crew precious minutes to prepare for battle. Fighter aircraft roared off the flight deck as the carrier turned into the wind, her escorts laying down a protective screen of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese attack developed with textbook precision despite the overwhelming odds. Kobayashi's dive bombers broke through the American fighter screen, their pilots displaying the same skill and determination that had made them the terror of the Pacific. The first bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck, penetrating deep into the ship's interior before exploding in a cascade of fire and steel. The second bomb hit near the island's superstructure, starting fires that sent black smoke billowing across the carrier's decks. But the Yorktown refused to die. Her damage control parties, trained to a fine edge by months of Pacific combat, fought the fires with desperate efficiency. The carrier's engineers, working in smoke-filled compartments while explosions shook the ship around them, restored power to essential systems with remarkable speed. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was back in operation, her flight deck repaired and aircraft launching once again. The sight of the apparently undamaged American carrier stunned the Japanese pilots, who had returned to the Hiryu. They reported sinking one carrier, but now reconnaissance aircraft were reporting the same ship operational and launching aircraft. The Japanese concluded they were facing 2 American carriers instead of one. Not realizing that Yankee ingenuity had brought the Yorktown back from the dead, Yamaguchi ordered a second strike, this time with 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. It was the last throw of the dice, the final gamble of a commander who refused to accept defeat. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who had led the morning attack on Midway, volunteered to lead this desperate mission despite his aircraft being damaged and low on fuel. The torpedo bombers launched from the Hiryu's deck with the solemnity of a funeral procession, their crews knowing they were likely flying to their deaths. The second attack succeeded where the first had failed. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the Yorktown below the waterline, flooding her engine rooms and bringing the great ship to a dead stop. The carrier began to list heavily to port, her crew preparing to abandon ship as flooding spread through her lower decks. But even as the Yorktown fought for her life, American dive bombers were already winging their way toward the Hiryu, guided by the carrier's own aircraft returning from the attack. The final act of the Battle of Midway was about to begin, and, with it, the end of Japanese naval aviation's dominance in the Pacific. The Hiryu, alone and defiant, would soon learn that courage, no matter how magnificent, could not overcome the mathematics of war. The Americans had found their target, and this time, there would be no escape. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the flight deck of the Hiryu as her crew prepared for the inevitable American counterattack. Admiral Yamaguchi stood beside Captain Kaku on the bridge, both men knowing that their ship represented the last hope of the Japanese striking force. Around them, the horizon was stained with the black smoke of their burning consorts, a constant reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in naval warfare. At 2:45 p.m., the Hiryu's radar operators detected the approaching American strike force. 24 SPD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, had found their target. The Japanese carrier turned desperately to avoid the attack, her escorts laying down a barrage of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky black with shell bursts. Zero fighters, hastily launched from the carrier's deck, climbed to intercept the American bombers. The battle was joined with savage intensity. Japanese fighters tore into the American formation, their experienced pilots displaying the same skill that had made them masters of the Pacific Air War. Several dauntless bombers fell to the Zero's guns, their crews dying far from home in the service of their country. But the majority of the American aircraft pressed through the fighter screen, their pilots grimly determined to complete their mission. Lieutenant Gallagher rolled his dive bomber into the attack, the Hiryu's flight deck growing larger in his bomb sight. As he plunged toward the target, the carrier's anti-aircraft guns filled the air with deadly metal, their shells exploding in black puffs that rocked his aircraft. Behind him, the other dive bombers of his squadron followed in sequence, each pilot waiting for the perfect moment to release his 1,000-pound bomb. The first bomb struck the Hiryu's flight deck at exactly 5 minutes past 3 p.m., penetrating the wooden planking and exploding in the hangar bay below. The detonation ignited stored aviation fuel and armed aircraft, creating a fireball that swept through the carrier's interior spaces. The second bomb, delivered by Ensign George Goldsmith, struck near the forward elevator and sent it crashing into the hangar deck in a shower of twisted metal and sparks. Within minutes, the Hiryu was following her sister ships into the flames. The fires spread with terrifying speed, fed by thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline and dozens of armed aircraft. Damage control parties fought valiantly to contain the blaze, but the conflagration had already grown beyond their ability to control. The carrier's magazines, heated by the intense fires, began to explode in sequence, each detonation sending shockwaves through the dying ship. Captain Kaku, his uniform singed by the heat of the fires consuming his ship, gave the order to abandon ship. The crew of the Hiryu had fought with extraordinary courage, but there was no saving the carrier now. The men who had served aboard the ship that had helped strike Pearl Harbor now faced the reality of defeat. Their proud vessel joining the funeral pyre of Japanese naval aviation, Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing to leave his flagship, chose to go down with the ship in accordance with the ancient traditions of the Imperial Navy. His final message to the combined fleet was a testament to the warrior spirit that had driven Japan's early conquests. We have lost our four carriers, but we have given our all. The enemy has been damaged, but the battle is not over. We die with honor, knowing that our sacrifice will inspire others to carry on the fight. The Hiryu continued to burn through the night, her fires visible for miles across the dark Pacific. The ship that had helped launch the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized Allied shipping from the Indian Ocean to the Central Pacific, was now a beacon marking the end of Japanese naval supremacy. When she finally slipped beneath the waves at 9 a.m. on June 5th, she took with her the last vestiges of Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The four carriers that had been the pride of the Imperial Navy were gone, along with their irreplaceable air groups and experienced pilots. In the space of a single day, Japan had lost the naval aviation strength that had taken years to build. The carefully trained air crews, the skilled mechanics, the specialized equipment all had been consumed in the fires of Midway. The Japanese fleet would never again possess the striking power that had made it the terror of the Pacific. The morning of June 5, 1942, dawned over a Pacific Ocean transformed by the events of the previous day, where once four proud aircraft carriers had cut through the waves in perfect formation. Now only oil slicks and floating debris marked their graves. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had been reduced to twisted metal and ashes, their destruction marking the end of Japan's offensive capability. In the Pacific War, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Midway operation and the attack on Pearl Harbor, received the devastating news aboard his flagship Yamato with stoic composure. The man who had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months had seen his prediction come true with mathematical precision. The 6 months were up, and with them, Japan's hope of dictating terms to the United States. The loss of the four carriers represented more than ships and aircraft. It was the destruction of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who had trained for years to perfect their deadly skills. The pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and dominated the Indian Ocean were gone, their expertise irreplaceable in wartime conditions. Japan's naval aviation training program, geared for peacetime expansion, could not quickly produce replacements for these elite airmen that Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard the Akagi during the battle, survived the carrier's destruction, only to spend months recovering from injuries sustained during the ship's final moments. His later writings would describe Midway as the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation, a turning point from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. The strategic implications of the defeat rippled across the Pacific like expanding waves. Japan's carefully constructed defensive perimeter, anchored by mobile carrier forces, had been shattered in a single day. The combined fleet, once the terror of Allied shipping, was reduced to a defensive posture, its remaining carriers too few and too valuable to risk in major offensive operations. The initiative in the Pacific had passed permanently to the American forces. Historical analysis from the U.S. Naval War College confirms that Midway marked the irreversible shift in Pacific naval power, with Japan losing approximately two-thirds of its trained carrier pilots in the battle and its aftermath. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood the magnitude of the victory even as reports continued to arrive at his Pearl Harbor headquarters. The intelligence breakthrough that had made the victory possible, the code-breaking efforts of Station HYPO, had proven that American ingenuity and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The same spirit that had built the Transcontinental Railroad and the Panama Canal had now turned the tide of global warfare. The human cost of the battle was staggering for both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,000 skilled naval personnel, including some of its most experienced pilots and aircrew. The United States lost 307 men, including the gallant aircrew of Torpedo Squadron 8, whose sacrifice had helped create the conditions for victory. Each name on the casualty lists represented a family forever changed by the demands of global warfare. The Yorktown, damaged but not destroyed in the battle, would meet her end 2 days later when the Japanese submarine I-168 struck her with 2 torpedoes while she was under tow. The carrier that had been repaired in 72 hours and had fought valiantly at Midway would become the battle's final casualty. Her loss a reminder that victory in war always comes at a price. As news of the victory spread across the United States, it marked the first major American triumph in the Pacific War. The nation that had endured the shock of Pearl Harbor, the fall of the Philippines, and months of Japanese conquest finally had reason to celebrate. The Battle of Midway had proven that the Japanese military machine was not invincible, that American forces could meet and defeat the enemy on equal terms. The ripple effects of Midway would continue to shape the Pacific War for the remainder of the conflict. Japan, stripped of its offensive naval aviation capability, would be forced into an increasingly defensive posture. The United States, emboldened by victory and supported by its massive industrial capacity, would launch a series of offensive operations that would carry American forces across the Pacific to the very shores of Japan itself. The Battle of Midway had lasted only for days, but its consequences would endure for generations. In the words of Admiral Nimitz's famous communique, Pearl Harbor has been partially avenged. Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence. The first step toward that goal had been taken in the waters around a small coral atoll where silence, steel, and fire had changed the course of history forever.